Alright, so I'm going to show you how to use the slab roller, and there's a couple things to know. The table is adjustable, and what that does is it changes the distance between the roller and the table so that your slab can be thicker or thinner. And the way to adjust that is to pull these things out. This one's covered in canvas, which is nice, but there's some that are just masonite, and the masonite ones are thinner, and then these ones are thicker, and there's three different boards that you can use to adjust the height of the table, to adjust the thickness of your slab. And so something that you might try to do before you roll your whole slab is take a little piece of clay and test the thickness of what you're going to get by rolling it across that. Now, something to remember too is that this fabric is attached to the slab roller. It's bolted on, and so we don't really want to get clay on it. We want to keep it as clean as we can, and so we like to put slab roller sheets, which are pieces of canvas, and they're stored in a locker here, right by the slab roller, and we like to put that down between the clay and the table and the roller. So I'm going to lay that down first. Something to know about your clay is that you don't have to wedge it. If you're going to roll it in a slab roller, it's going to compress and it's going to get pretty wedged. So you can see this clay hasn't been manipulated at all. I just pulled it out of the bin. But when you are rolling a slab, keep in mind that as the roller moves across, it's only pushing the clay down the table. It's not pushing it wider. So it's not going to expand that way. And you have to make the clay as wide as you want it to be already before you roll it. Otherwise, you're going to get a really long, skinny strip. So my piece of clay, I'm just going to sort of shape it into a cylinder. And I could say, my slab, that's how wide I want my slab to be. And I'm going to set it here, close to the roller. The roller's rolled all the way back. Set it here on top of this extra cloth. Fold the cloth over it to keep the clay from getting on the attached piece of fabric. And then I like to flip this canvas over on top like this. And you can see that the roller is just going to roll right across the top of that. You're going to roll towards yourself to make the roller move down the table, and when you're on top of the clay, you don't want to stop, because there's a little bit of a slight lift from the action of rolling that happens when you're doing it, that if you stop rolling in the middle of your slab, you're actually going to get a little divot from the roller dropping slightly. So keep moving. As soon as you hit the clay, move all the way across till you're done rolling your slab. Okay, so I felt it go across. I'm going to go back. Okay, now make sure that you aren't going to roll this up in the roller. Sometimes when people flip these back, they accidentally end up rolling it up into the roller. That's why I like to throw it down the table, and that way that doesn't happen. There's no chance of that happening. If you put too much pressure on this roller, there are cables underneath that can snap, and there are special cables that are made just for this particular old school slab roller, and you have to wait a while for them to come in the mail. And so if you break the cables, we can't use it for a while. So make sure you're not wrapping the cloth around the roller, putting too much strain on the cables underneath, okay? So here's my slab. Okay, it's all nice and even. This thickness is for me a good thickness for hand building, but if you're doing some other kind of project where you want it thinner, you just put more boards in the table, raise the table a little bit to the roller so that you get a thinner slab. You can also take the boards out and get a much thicker slab, but this is a pretty average, good hand building thickness for what we're going to do today, and so I'm happy with that. Again, the discoloration where you see two colors of clay, that's just oxidation. That doesn't mean anything, and it's not going to show up in your piece. All right, now another thing I like to do, because I have this piece of canvas here, I like to just pick it up with a piece of canvas to carry it over to my workspace. What we can do with this slab to get it off this canvas is just flip it over like that. You don't really want to leave the slab roller canvases on the table where you're working. Put them back so other people can use them. Also, that way they can dry out. See, there's a big wet spot where the clay was. They need to dry out so that the next person's piece doesn't stick to the canvas. All right, so here's a slab that we can work with. And there's different ways to work with a slab. We can press a slab into a form. We can wrap a slab around a form, or we can simply build with the slabs on the table. So I'm going to show you a couple of different things that we can do with this slab. We do have these cutters, and obviously they're not going to be the perfect size for every piece, but we have circles and squares, and they're just like a biscuit cutter, and you can just push it on and then release the clay by popping that out. It's a very quick and easy way to get a perfect circle or square to get started with if you want to. Now, I was going to use this then to get started on this bowl. And one of the things that's actually a very traditional thing to do with hand building, and this comes from the Native American tradition, is to have a form that you press clay into to get started. And then you build the rest of it with coils. And so you can do that. You can have a fast start with a perfectly symmetrical form. And usually the Native American people are going to be making their own bowl and bisque firing it and then pressing clay into that. We have all sorts of bowls in the studio, different sizes to do that with. Now, the only thing you don't need to spray oil on when you're pressing clay onto a form would be a plaster. Plaster draws water out of clay and then the clay pulls away from the plaster, and you don't need to use grease. But anything else, plastic or anything that you're using to press clay into, it's going to want to stick to that. And so if you don't spray it with a release, this is just vegetable oil. You can use baby oil. I like vegetable oil because it goes on nice and thin, and it doesn't build up in there, and it doesn't usually start to rot, which can happen with baby oil and Vaseline. Vaseline also has a texture, so I prefer vegetable oil because it's nice and light. You just give a quick spray, make sure the whole thing has some, and then you're going to be able to press the clay into that form, and you press it down nice and firm and get that clay in there, and that's going to make a nice perfect sort of starting point for your pot, for your form, whatever you're making, and that gets you a good start, but also this supports the clay. And so as you're building, one of the things you're going to run into hand building is that the clay is going to start to want to flop around. It's going to get it's going to start slumping. It's not going to want to stand up. At a certain point, you're going to have to stop and let it set up a little bit, let it dry, and then continue to work on it maybe the next day. But with this, what this does is it's doing that supporting so that you could actually build a little bit more than you would otherwise. Now, to continue building on this, I could roll coils or I could cut slabs. So I'm going to cut a strip from here. And whenever we join clay together, we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to make the clay bond and stick together. So what we want to do is, I like to use a fork and just kind of chew up the edge. We call this scoring. And I'm not lightly scraping like that. I'm digging. I'm creating a place where water can sit, and I'm going to spray some water in there. Some people like to put vinegar in their water, and the reason for that is that clay sticks better together with acid. Any kind of acid bite is going to make it stick better together. But you get to a point sometimes where you just don't want to smell that vinegar. And so I stopped putting it in my joining water. I used to do that, and it is a good idea. You certainly, if you're fixing a crack or something, you should probably use a little bit of vinegar. But clay is acid. It needs to be acid to stick to itself. And so vinegar can help with that. but just make sure that it's nice and wet, and I've scored the edge in here as well. And I'm going to take this piece of clay and I'm going to join it, slightly overlapping a little bit, join it by pushing on it and sealing that edge. And everywhere that I join the clay, I want to have a score mark. So I'm going to put another piece right here on the score mark, join it, and then when you get the piece out of the bowl, when it starts to set up a little bit and strong enough to pull out without changing shape, then you can clean up the outside. But as long as you press it against the form and you're not pressing it so much that it's getting thinner, you're going to have a nice consistent shape coming up out of this bowl. Okay, so you can build up until you start to see the form slumping, changing a little bit, and then you should stop and let it set up. One of the tricks to hand building is paying attention to the softness of the clay and how much the clay can still do without falling down, when to stop and when to come back, because as the clay sets up, it gets stronger. Okay, now another thing you can do with a slab is you can wrap it around a form. One of the things to worry about with this, wrapping it around something, is that you have to get it off by like the next day or it's going to crack itself because it's going to shrink down onto that form. All you need is one thin sheet of paper, really. But the idea of the paper, of wrapping it around your form, is that you can have something that can slide off easily. So when you wrap the paper around this form, you're going to tape it to itself. So I'm going to roll that around like this. Trying to make it nice and snug. And then I'm going to tape it to itself. If I taped it to the form, then it wouldn't slide off. But if I tape it to itself, I can slide it off. And it might need to slide off while I'm trying to get the clay off. Okay? Normally I would like to use masking tape to do this, but this is what I have right now. Alright, so this piece of paper, if I'm pulling hard on the clay trying to get it off, this piece of paper can come off. Okay, it can slide with the clay, and it'll be easier to get off. But you can't leave it on for more than a day, or it's going to shrink down and crack itself onto the form. That's the problem with putting clay over a form. Inside of a form, you could leave that forever. You could let it dry in there if you wanted to. So this is a good tool for working with hand building. This is called a fettling knife. I like to have a fettling knife and a fork and a needle tool, some water. A spray bottle works good. Sometimes you're going to want a bucket with a sponge in it, but those are the basic tools you'll need. You can also use rulers to get nice and accurate with your shapes and your cutting. That can be a good idea. Just to go quickly here, for that sake, I'm just doing it freehand. But you could measure with a ruler and get it nice and neat and get all your edges straight with each other. So I'm going to cut a piece here that I can wrap around this form. Okay, now I'm going to test it by giving it a try, rolling it around and see where it lands. And then I'm going to make a mark there for where I can cut this off. Okay, now what's going to happen when I roll this around is I'm going to want to join these two edges right here. So right there, I want to do my scoring. And this is really going to help the clay to stick to the other piece of clay and get it wet. Make sure it's sticky. And then I'm just going to kind of press it on there. Like that. And now I can just kind of join it a little bit more. This is a really useful tool. This is a paddle. Can clean up your shapes. Most of your cleaning up is going to be when the clay is a little bit drier, because the clay doesn't want to cooperate much when it's really soft, but you can get some basic cleaning up done. Now, one thing you don't want to do when you do this is roll it. If you roll it, you thin it out and it falls off. So don't be tempted to do that. When you get cracks like this will happen with hand building clay, because we don't have things in the clay like ball clay that are making it really plastic. So you just pinch that back together. That's just on the surface anyway. Just gonna pinch it back together, flatten it, you know, and you'll do a lot of your cleaning up, your smoothing when the clay's a little bit drier. But this is your basic form that you wanted, and then you can let that set up. And it's better if you could stand it up, because then you don't end up with a flat side on the piece, and it might slide down a little bit because it is, you know, the weight of it might pull it down. But this is a good way to get a really fast cylinder. And you can do it in a much bigger piece if you want. You can piece some slabs together to do a nice big cylinder. We have some really large cylinder rolls that you can use. This is a smaller one just to show you the possibilities. So in fact, if you wanted to, you could make a cylinder that's the same dimension as your starting place with your bowl, and attach that to the bowl. Get a really fast, nice cylindrical piece with a nice round bottom. Okay, so this is one way to work with slabs. Now another way is to simply do everything with your hands, and I'll show you how to do that. And with slabs, let's say this is our bottom piece. With slabs, like I said, we always want to join the edges really well. So we're gonna score it, we're gonna wet it, and we're gonna wiggle it on there. We can clean up the form later. The most important thing right now is making sure that it's stuck down. And then we're gonna try to sort of overlap that outer edge. And then one of the things I like to do with slabs, especially when we're joining a base to a wall, is I like to make a tiny coil, which is called a fillet. Just a really skinny one. And then score that seam, put a little water on it, and press this little coil in real tight. A couple things to think about when you're hand building. You don't want the clay to pull apart at the seams where you join it. And so reinforcing that seam is always a good idea. You can always carve it out a little bit later if you made it too thick, but always reinforce those seams. Also keep in mind that you can't have anything that's more than 1 inch thick. It can't be, you know, let's say rule of thumb, it can't be any thicker than your thumb, because what happens is the clay won't let the moisture out from the middle. It gets trapped in there, and no matter how dry it seems from the outside, if you put it in the kiln, that moisture is going to expand and explode and break the piece. So when you're hand building, don't make anything more than 1 inch thick, and also try to make everything the same thickness. Okay, now if I was going to join another piece to this, I would have to score here, wherever the clay is going to join. Make sure everything's well scored. Wet it and push it on there. Join those edges, overlap it, pinch it down, overlap it, and then also let's do another fillet, but here and here. Okay, so that way we're going to make sure our joints are really well joined. Our clay is all about the same thickness. We're not building more than 1 inch thick, and you should be able to do this with that piece of clay and not have that seam tear. Okay, you make sure that your joints are super joined. If you don't do this sort of joining process, if you're not really careful, things pull apart and it's very disappointing. You get cracks where the seams are. You have pieces come absolutely off of your form. Like if you try to stick something on like that and then expect it to stay, that's going to come off when it gets fired. It might even come off when it's shrinking and drying. Another thing to think about when hand building is that you can't let things dry super fast. You're going to have to wrap everything up with plastic until you can come back to it. It will still dry and set up a little bit under the plastic, but you have to slow down the drying, or it dries. If it's completely dry, you won't be able to add anything. You won't add any clay to it. Also very likely to crack if it dries super fast. I have this piece of clay already pressed into a bowl, and the traditional way amongst the Native American tribes is to start with a press mold, which means you've pressed something in. They actually call it a poke. You press some clay into a form so that you have a really nice, perfect base. And the Native American people are going to make their own pokés, but this is just a plastic bowl that I'm using. And if you're going to use one, make sure that you spray it with some oil. Make sure that it's going to have a release between it and the plastic, otherwise you'll never get it out in one piece. You can't use these kinds of forms without a release, or it's just, you have to tear it out. All right, so I've got some clay pressed in here that we did with a slab, and then I'm going to show you coiling. Now, coil building, this is the way that I built most of my work in graduate school, the big sculptures. I would take a nice sandy, groggy clay with a lot of tooth in it, and then kind of pinch it out. And I didn't wedge my clay. In hand building, I don't usually tell my students they have to, unless your clay is too dry and you want to wedge some water into it. That's something you could do. But most of the time, I feel like you don't want to work out your wrists and your hands any more than you have to when you're working. So a coil, you start out with it mostly sort of pinched out evenly, something big and fat like this, and then you can just start rolling it. And our tables here have canvas on them so that you can do this. This is one of the reasons we have canvas top tables, so you can just use your table as a place to roll out coils, because coils are going to be sticking to smooth surfaces. If you're trying to roll on a smooth surface, you're going to have a hard time. But a canvas top table is a perfect spot for a coil. Now, one of the mistakes that people make when they're coil building is they'll roll their coils out to these super little, tiny little coils, and it takes them the rest of their lives to build a little pot with coils like that. What I like to do is, some people might think it's sort of a combo of coil building and slab building, but I like to flatten my coil. And that way I have a coil rolled piece of clay. This is a coil still, but it's going to build sort of like a slab into the piece. And I get the thickness that I want it to be. And then it's about the thickness of the clay is here. And then I want to join it, so I'm going to score it, dig some nice gouges in there, make it receptive to water, spray some water in there. You can also use a sponge to put water on your piece. Spray bottle, I think, is a little more efficient. But if you don't have a spray bottle, you could use a sponge. And then you're going to score that edge that you're joining. And then I'm just going to press it on there. Remember to use a little bit of force when you're pressing clay together. And don't worry so much about whether you're distorting the shape right now. You can always fix that. The important thing here is to get it stuck onto the other clay. Okay, I'm going to squeeze those ends together. Okay, so that's how you get that coil on there. And then you're just going to try to join the edges together, scrape the edge over the other edge. Something you have to watch out for when you're building inside a form like this is what's happening right here. So you can pull it back and clean it a little bit. And you're going to be able to really clean it later, but don't make this job super hard for yourself later. Just kind of clean it up. Reach in there and clean it up a little bit before you move on, right where it joins at the edge of the bowl. Okay, and then you won't have as much issue with it later on, trying to clean that and make it look nice. And then just press it back onto the bowl. And then you're also going to want to join this edge together, and you're just pushing them together with your fingers. There's going to be a little bit of water there from having sprayed it. It'll help you to smear those edges together. Okay? Alright, now as you go, as you're forming, you may want to shape your piece to make it prettier as you go up. You can use a paddle to clean up your form as much as you like. Now you don't have to start with a base like this when you're coil building. You can start on the table, and if you're going to start on the table, what I like to recommend is that you get a board of some kind, like this, and then you put a piece of, it could be a single sheet, piece of newspaper there, and then you can start, you set your piece there. What can happen if you don't put a piece of paper between your piece and the board is that it can attach itself to that. It'll dry a little bit and shrink, and it'll crack. You want something that can slide, something that that's not going to keep this from being able to shift a little bit. You should always try to shift your stuff anyway, but the newspaper is really going to help with that. It's going to keep this from getting stuck to the board, especially if you're using water. It'll keep that from happening. And just another thing to keep in mind, just always build with about the same thickness. You don't want any parts of this to be extra thick or extra thin. What happens in the kiln is that, well, even in drying, if something has more water in it, or it's thicker or thinner, it's going to shrink differently. And you want the whole thing to shrink the same way. One way to avoid cracking is to slow down the drying process, but also to make sure everything's the same thickness. And that way it dries and shrinks the same, and it's going to heat up at the same rate in the kiln when it's heating up. It's not going to, some of it's not going to get hot faster and then break away from the rest of it. So you got to think about that. Think about what's going to make it through the kiln process, through the firing process, and think about those things while you're here, while you're making these things. Now, another thing in hand building is that you don't want to trap air. So let's say I made a form that we're going to close. And I think when I hand build, I use a combination of slab and pinch and coil. It's like I don't really differentiate too much between the three methods. You don't have to, but there are basically three methods. So one is just sort of pinching a form like this into a shape. One is rolling out coils, and one is rolling out slabs. So those are the traditional three hand building methods. So I'm going to make a form now. It's going to look to you like a potato as I make it. And I'm just going to pinch it out so I can make it fast, join it, and talk to you about what this is. Now, with hand building, we want a clay body that isn't going to shrink a lot. It's going to have a lot of hand building strength. It's going to stand up for you while you're building. It's a different clay body from the throwing clay body, because the throwing clay body, we're really concerned about its ability to stretch. And so we put things in it that stretch really well, but it also, unfortunately, increases the shrinkage rate. And so we don't need that with hand building clay. And so hand building clay, it's going to feel a lot stronger to you than throwing clay. It's going to have tooth in it. It's going to have more sand and grog, and it might crack a little bit when you bend it, but you can always just smooth out those cracks because it's not going to be as stretchy as throwing clay. Okay, so now I'm going to get this closed off. And with a closed form, you can't leave a form closed and fire it. You have to actually poke a hole in it, and it can just be a needle tool, poking a hole through to let the pressure out, to let the air out, so that when it expands with heat, it doesn't expand and break the piece. All right. So basically, I made a rock, a hollow rock. But if I have all of the space contained, if I don't have any holes in it, I should be able to manipulate this form as I like. Because it's sort of like a balloon. Like you have a certain amount of air trapped in there. And if it can't get out, then it's going to contain the same amount of air space no matter what shape it's in. So if I paddle it, it's going to hold up. It's not going to collapse on me as I'm paddling. And I'm going to smooth it with my fingers as well, but I'm going to turn this into a much nicer shape. You saw I started out with this big ugly potato, but I can make that into something much more controlled. Now you don't want to paddle for too long or too hard, because then what you end up doing is making the clay thicker. You just want to gently shape it for a little bit with the paddle and make it into a nicer form. I could actually make this into I'll make it into a sphere. See how it's changing? And it's staying the same size because it's got the same amount of air inside of it. So it's kind of a fun little trick if you want to make something that's hollow, kind of fast. If you trap the air inside, you can make a shape that you're kind of going for, starting out with this funky potato kind of rock shape that I started with. Okay, see how it's getting nicer and rounder. This is a hollow shape, and we got it kind of fast. You didn't have to build it up in halves and join it together later the way that you might otherwise do. Okay, but once you're done, don't forget to put a hole in it. I've seen too many things blow up in the kiln because somebody had a contained space in their sculpture that they forgot to poke a hole in. You always have to have a way for the air to push out really hard when it's expanding in the heat. You can't close off a space and put it in the kiln like that. Okay? All right. So that's hand building.